Hey guys and girls, Board now back for this week's Line of Duty, and holy cow, it was all action, all systems go at the end of this episode, I can tell you, with a great cliffhanger for next week to get you all talking. Thanks again for last week's responses, and here we go. I'm going to start off this week by talking about poor old Mr. Buckles, because he got arrested at the end of last week's, brought in for a questioning by AC-12, and there's a few different things that they question him over. First of all, there's the fact that the witness from last week, Deborah, actually turns out to have a past connection with Buckles. Basically, there's a series of like incriminating, dodgy-looking texts between the two, where it turns out that he got her off like an assault charge back in 2012, and AC-12 certainly believes then he gave her, so he got her off that charge. They apparently were having a relationship, which he doesn't totally deny, and that as a result, all these years later, it appears as though she comes forward as a witness for him, claiming that she saw Terry Boyles in the pub that night, and that's going to lead to getting him a conviction. And first of all, just a small pet peeve about that moment and the conversation about Deborah, because her name is something like Deborah Deborah, and they kept saying it in quite quick, and that kept distracting me just because it's DD and it's like similar sounding words, so that did actually bug me quite a lot. But next up, they talk about, from Buckles, about being a scapegoat, which is just this brilliant, like, brummy sort of expression. And Ted is like classic Ted, and he's like, scapegoat, how dare you, sir? and then there's a question mark about Ryan, about the fact that he is like this ex-offender who's like still serving his sort of punishment, and that he's re-entered back into the system in this role as officer, and it was during like Buckles' time at that like precinct, so there's question marks over exactly why that happened under Buckles' watch. Buckles claims ignorance to this, basically claiming that he was not responsible for replacing Velda with Ryan, and of course that causes some suspicion, and that was actually Joe's decision, or that she was instrumental in that. But vetting, basically, they didn't vet Ryan properly, and he appears to have no recollection or no knowledge of Ryan's past offences. And of course the big denouement, if you like, of the scene is that reveal that they have the missing files of that case was found in Buckles' trunk. And I didn't think of this last week, but did anyone else think of the caddy from back in season 3 went with all the golf clubs? Wow, how did I think of that? But no, apparently not. It's just something my crazy mind thought of for a minute, and I marked out big time. Just saying. And Buckles' reaction to that is just brilliant. He just looks so bemused, and it's like, what the hell's going on here? And it's a great reaction for this character of Buckles, because he's the sort of character who normally is very sort of quite cocky, quite assured of himself, normally has a sort of a witty, like, sort of comeback line. And the fact that he's totally floored by this and is just confused, and he starts looking around and just... he can't give them an answer. Like, he says, I've clearly been fitted up here, I've been stitched up, but he can't give them an answer of who did it, and so basically they charge him. He goes to prison. The fact that he is so stunned and speechless, I think, almost is sort of nodding to the audience that this guy has actually been stitched up. I mean, if he hadn't have been, then maybe he would come up with an answer or something, and he wouldn't be so flawed, because in the previous sort of exchanges and questions he had actually come up with some kind of answers, albeit quite weak ones. So that sort of hints to me that definitely Joe has sort of framed him, and Steve's reaction and suspicions sort of leads that way as well. He has a conversation later with Kate where he sort of voices this to her, but Kate isn't having any of it, and she's basically. It's actually a nice scene because it sort of outlines why Kate left AC-12, and she gives this rationale. Well, sometimes you're a bit too suspicious or cynical. If you investigate bent cops too much, then you end up thinking every cop is bent, sort of thing. So it's a great scene because it's like a good rationale for her leaving AC-12, and it's basically her defending Joe in that instance. And thank you to one of my new subs from last week who actually pointed out who the new girl was. I finally got a name and now I remember it. The girl who's been working with Steve a lot at ET12. Her name is Chloe, the new character for the season, or one of them. So thanks for a sub who pointed that out. And I won't forget it. And just to say, she's brilliant in this episode. She's really fitting into the show nicely, having some good interaction. She's very strong in these interview scenes where she's like coming up with the files and putting some of the questions to the suspects. So again, good stuff with her in this episode. And there's a really interesting theory in the comments from last week about who she could be in the grand scheme of things, that she might have, let's say, a strong connection to a former Line of Duty character from a long time ago. So that's interesting. It's sort of blown my mind. So keep those theories coming. I won't say anything in here because I don't really want to, tempt any spoilers, although it hasn't been revealed one way or the other. But that's very interesting stuff. But yeah, I'm enjoying her character so far this season. So I'll switch back to Ryan at this point. Him and Joe, actually, this episode, they're sort of connected by plot. Hastings wants to pull Ryan out and question him because of the stuff that came out last week. And Kate actually says, no, it's best to leave him be at the moment because it's hard to get anything on him, any clear-cut evidence. The best way to deal with it is to leave him in place and for me just to sort of monitor him, which Ted agrees to. And what basically happens is they find out that Ryan has been following Joe, and there's this disagreement between Steve and between Kate over the nature of it. Again, Kate sort of has this newfound loyalty to Joe. It doesn't believe that she's crooked in any way, and Steve questions, well, are they meeting up? Is it more than just that he's following her? And Hastings is sort of on Steve's side there because he's basically saying, well, at this point, we can't take anything for granted. And they tell Kate not to mention anything to Joe, not to tip her off. And Kate, of course, does the opposite because, of course, she does. She's, I guess, concerned for Joe and actually comes to her with that information. Joe comes up with this excuse to get Ryan out of the department, to clear him off, post him out, whatever term you want to use. And that's just because an officer and we sort of need to make room for a replacement. And sorry, it's no offense, but because of your lack of experience and you're a junior, then you're the one that's been chosen. He does it very diplomatically, but then it sort of turns around on her because Ryan comes to her later at night and comes up from behind, has a gun pointed at her. It's we're going to have a discussion, and basically hints that we're going to talk about why I won't be leaving the department. So the next morning, Joe's up with an excuse when she talks to Kate, and it's an excuse why Ryan is still in the department. And she claimed 18 months ago, I think it was, or something. So it's unlikely that really in that time he's been up to any dodgy sort of doing, and sort of claims, yeah, then vetting really, they should have been on top of it. So if they didn't find anything wrong, then chances are that there's nothing sort of suspect about Ryan. And I really like that scene as well, because at the end of it, just to get Kate off her back, Joe basically comes out with this remark about, well, actually, you could be the one who's like reported and posted out of the department, because with Terry Boyles of that night, where you were apparently following them, and yet you were late getting sort of help and backup to sort of save lives in that example. And it's this really mean sort of swipe at Kate, but you can totally see why she's doing it. Carry out the search on Vida's apartment, like a second search, looking for more DNA, and it's sort of drawn out over the episode. But sorry, I said I wasn't going to get her name wrong. Chloe carries out the search, and basically it reveals that Joe's DNA was in Vida's flat, but so was another DNA, another suspicious looking DNA, which is hinted to Hastings that it's a former police officer and someone from the past. It's basically suggested that it's someone they know from the past, a big name. And even more of note is the fact that it's a blood relation to Joe Davison. So bum, the music hits, and we've got our fantastic cliffhanger at the end of the episode. So get talking in the comments. Who in the blue hell could it be? Who's the blood relation? Whose DNA was found, and who's the relative to Joe Davison? This is all very exciting stuff. It's a great cliffhanger for the episode. Now, I think the MVP of this episode is actually Hastings, and the performance by Adrian Dunbar in the episode, because it sort of quite early on in the episode, one of the big turns is that the powers that be, who he was sort of already on thin ice with, and they certainly have ulterior motives, they find out that he arrested Buckles behind their back without their approval, and again sort of interfering and all that. And as far as they're concerned, it's sort of one straw too far. So his superior basically says to Hastings that you're gonna have to leave. We're gonna basically replace you. And again, it's like the politics, the sort of diplomatic type tone, trying to cover up what's really going on. But the way she propositions it is that you can just take your retirement early, sort of thing. But we won't. You've got till, it's something like 3 months or something, but she says to him that we won't make it clear in public why you're leaving. We'll just make it look like you're taking your retirement. And again, it's a great scene, and just the fallout of it and the reaction of Hastings and the acting from Dunbar is top drawer, and it really captures his fury and his disappointment, his anger. And I think it does a great job in selling just how much pride he's got in AC12 and what they do, and the fact that he almost more than any character on the show, I think just because he's been there so long and this has become his life's work, then more than anyone else, he is just against, corruption in the system, and he takes pride on sort of corruption and bent cops and bringing people like that to justice, and it's become almost his life's work. Out then his replacement is going to be this chief officer who he suspects of being involved in all this dodgy business and cover-ups in the past, and his fury, and it's like, what a slap in the face to the department, by the way, and shock and just really upset. You can see he's taking it so hard. There's some great close-up shots of his face, and again the actor does a great job in selling it, and just how drained he is emotionally, I think, because at one point there's scenes where he's with Kate and with Steve, and he's sort of sending them these messages. You've got the line where he talks, I think Chloe's in the room as well, but where he says there's the line about the fire sort of thing. No matter over the next few months, I'm hoping all of you will carry the fire. Though that might be another Irish expression, I don't know, but it's a great line, and there's just the way he transmits it, like in his body language, where I think Kate and Steve can have cottoned on to the fact that there's something not quite right with Ted. There's acting, and I think because of this, and because of the importance of that decision and the effect it has on Ted, I think Ted does become like the MVP of this episode. But I think also it's good writing because it increases the stakes, because it means they've got a certain period of time before Ted leaves his job. Now, obviously, that could still be reversed later, or something could happen, but it raises stakes for this case sort of thing, because they might not solve it before Ted's quote unquote retirement. So all that was great stuff. The final big element of the episode is with the AC-12 looking into the Gail Vera stuff, and they listen to an old recording of her on her podcast interviewing this ex-police officer, this ex-force member, and I have to say I recognised the actor's voice straight away, and I had a feeling it was him, and it proved to be him. It was, of course, the guy out of The Office, Neil out of The Office, who played the Swindon boss. So I've seen him pop up in quite a few things since, and you can tell he's a bit older, a bit greyer, but you can still tell it was him. And I could tell by the voice, so that definitely says something. But he's on this recording, and she's trying to prod him to get information. And he gives her little tidbits without actually giving her much. And he suggests that there might have been like a racial element to this one particular case. And it gets mentioned. Roz's name gets mentioned. Roz, as in the Tandy Newton Roz from series 4. So they're jumping all over the different series here. But that's all that he gives Gail on this podcast. Um, Again, that's really good writing, because it subtly weaves in this past season, this past case, without being sort of forced. It like naturally comes out in this conversation they hear on the podcast. So it's really good stuff, the way they're sort of drawing all these previous series like storylines together to build up the current storyline and the overall arc. I think it's really good serialized storytelling, and that's what makes Line of Duty stand out. I think partly from other procedural shows, it almost feels like quite an American show in that sense, the way they are now drawing from these different past arcs, but it's like all part of the bigger sort of picture. So it's all really well handled stuff. But yeah, this ex police officer is nervous to give many more details, and he backs out of that interview without saying anything else. He kind of comes across as too afraid of the consequences, and so they find out who he is, and he's this ex cop Jimmy, and they go to talk to him in prison. And I think again some good acting in this scene, because it's I think it's Steve and Chloe go to interview him, and he just says to them that he's too afraid of the consequences. And I like the way it digs into his character here, because Steve tries to almost like call his bluff, and to try and, as a way to try and force his hand into giving them information about this past case, where he says, I did some digging on you, and it turns out you live quite a glamorous lifestyle, good looking women, fast cars, all the rest of it. And so almost saying to him, well, surely you miss that lifestyle. Prison is hardly, it's a big come down for you from that. And he concedes that, but he says at the same time, if it's a choice between that and keeping my life, then yeah, I don't want to die, basically. So it's almost like I'm going to keep my gob shut, because otherwise I they could kill me in here, basically. The sort of plants could kill me. So again, it's building up that side. And so Steve comes up with this plan, and the plan is that they go undercover, that being AC-12. They pretend to be like a prison sort of transit. And so they arrange to go and pick Jimmy up. And so they pick him up, and Steve has all the legal paperwork there on the spot. And he says to him, we can get you out of prison now. This is your last day in prison. If you talk to us, we can keep you safe, and you don't have to worry about them knocking you off, basically. So we've got all the legal paperwork. We can get you out if you cooperate with us. And then, of course, no surprise, these are the sort of people who will go to extremes to try and cover things up, to try and stop this from happening. And this is when it all goes action in the episode, full blown action. You start getting, vans pull up with guns, and there's a big shootout, and there's a sniper at one point, in the top window of a building, shooting at, because the van with Steve and Jimmy has been knocked over, and they're suddenly vulnerable. Steve has to call Chloe in for help, and this other officer. And it's great action. It's really well directed, actually, because it's very tense, and just the sort of direction, because there's a couple of great aerial shots as well when the camera pulls up, and you just see the van on its side, and obviously they're inside. So it's really tense. Well done scene, and it's like, oh, okay, we don't get scenes like that too often in Line of Duty, but very well done, very gripping. And at one point there is a sacrifice, because this other officer who's quite close to Chloe, she goes in to try and get Steve and Jimmy out, but then she's actually shot by the sniper, who eventually Steve gets. He basically shoots him, and that sort of ends it for the time being. But it's like, oh my god, yeah, it's so intense, and they actually do a good job of selling that officer's death. Chloe again must have been quite close to her, because she's really traumatized and just very upset. And again, maybe because Chloe's quite new to the department and to the job and stuff, and to actually witness that probably shook her up. But Jimmy, they get him in, and we're expecting this big dramatic sort of interview, and for some big information to come out, and it's like, no. It's like, sorry, I'm just going to be straight with you. I can't do this. He says, and Hastings gets really pissed off with him, because he's arguing after what just happened. We just lost an officer and all that, and Jimmy rash reasons. Well, and it's lucky it was only one officer. That could have been a whole lot worse. These people do not mess about. It's best for everyone if I don't talk to you. And he backs out, and classic Hastings, I'll get him out of my sight, sort of thing. And later on, the turn is that Jimmy gets killed. He gets killed in prison, and notably, it's in front of Buckles, almost as a warning to Buckles. Yeah, you better keep your mouth shut as well, otherwise this could be your future. And yeah, Buckles just looks so dejected and downtrodden, and Jimmy's killed. And it serves two purposes, because it also serves as a message to Jo about her potentially ratting them out as well, because Ryan comes to her later and says, yeah, did you hear Jimmy got killed in prison? And Joe's like, well, what was the reason? And Ryan's like, well, because he was a rat, and it's almost like a pointed threat to Joe. So I think as it goes on here, I think I'm sort of guessing that maybe Joe obviously is in deep and up to no good, but then maybe to a certain extent she isn't as in deep as some of the others, and yeah, she's just sort of they've now got this stuff on her and she can't sort of get out. And yeah, lots to talk about. What a great episode again. I can't wait for the rest of this season. And what do you think about Steve? Also, maybe give us some thoughts on that, his future, because obviously he continues to have these personal problems. A small scene with him in this episode is that um, his ex girlfriend meets him for like a drink again, and in the first episode of the series, she was like, "Well, maybe you could come over to our department and have a change." A bit like obviously Kate has been doing, and Steve in this episode says, "Well, can we put those plans on hold for the moment? We've got a big case like boiling at the moment," and she obviously accept that. But yeah, what do you think will happen with Steve? Because there's a lot of stuff going on in his personal life. You got the stuff with him and like John's widow. So you just maybe get the impression there's something big coming up with the Steve character, maybe at the end of this season. So thoughts on that. But yeah, great episode again. More Line of Duty next week. Thanks, guys. See you again soon. Goodbye.